more or less adult life. I did love with two singers, not at the same time, but almost. And so I know about people who are dealing with trying to make a sound when you're not feeling good. It's a drag. You do everything you can. And we got to get Gary through this, so be very gentle with him tonight.
I actually feel fine. I just don't, I don't know where my octaves are, and if you can understand what I'm saying.
So, should I talk just a little bit to give you a break?
Please.
Okay. Okay, let's start back in the middle of the 17th century then. It's one of my, actually, I don't know which is my favorite century. Maybe when the Queen of France killed all the Huguenots after they came to the wedding of her son-in-law. That was a pretty good moment. That's about 1570s or so. St. Bartholomew's Mass. European history is so fascinating, and the music that goes with it goes hand in hand. So I actually know dates more by who the composers were and where the works are than who the kings and queens were. 17th century had a lot of interesting points, but we're dealing now with the 18th century. It was not so long. You're trying to think, it's hard to imagine how powerful the regimes were. The Austrian regime, they had about like 500 secret policemen who were just snooping around Vienna all the time. It's hard to sounds like Soviet Union in the old days. I don't think the Soviets made it up. All the European kings have been doing it for a long time. My favorite, the reason I was thinking about the 17th century, there was the 30 Years' War. It's the Great Religious War. Started when the Austrians went to tell the people in Prague that they couldn't be Protestants anymore. And the Bohemians heard them out and said, that's very interesting. Let us show you this spot in our castle. They took them up and they threw them out the window of the castle. It's the defenestration of Prague. It's one of my favorite moments. I actually got to see that spot. I'd heard that there was a big horse, like the horses were down below. So I thought, so they landed in them. It wasn't nice, but they weren't hurt. No, it's rock, and it's about 60 feet. But the interesting thing is that the woman who sent some around to pick up the French or the Austrian legation is part of our show. She's the great-grandmother of Lobkowitz.
Oh, wow.
Because she was bloody well Catholic. Forget these Protestant guys. She was connected with Austria, and they stayed resolutely Catholic. Remember, they were the guys who had sent the Habsburg kings to be down the King of Spain. They brought us the Spanish Inquisition. But I'm starting to get a little bit carried away with all of this. Let's get back to Beethoven. When he gets to Vienna, it's right around the time of the French Revolution. Things are really changing. Yeah, Mr. Dillon, you're right. The American Revolution had been just, 15 years before, if that. And he's working for an aristocracy which was nearly total in its power over poor people. And Beethoven was sort of poor people. His name, Ludwig van Beethoven, means Louis from the Beet Garden. Sort of comes from Holland, most likely. It's probably a Dutch derivation. His grandfather, when he got there, was a wonderful musician who married a Rhineland maiden. I think I may mention this piece. She was dreadfully fond of Rhine wine. Not good. And then she birthed an alcoholic son who was Beethoven's father. So that's the send-up for our poor guy. Getting to Vienna, he desperately wanted to meet Mozart, and he did when he's about 16 years old. He made his way to Vienna from Bern, a long way for a little kid, young kid. And he met Beethoven one afternoon. Beethoven thought he played the piano really well. What really got Beethoven was the way this young man improvised. Beyond that, they didn't have people taking down notes at the time, so this is all sort of like folk tale. But I believe these things. I think Mozart said, this kid's got something extra. Keep an eye on him. And then Beethoven went back to Bonn to take care of his family because his father was trying to drink his way through every money they had. And then by the time that Beethoven gets back to Vienna, Mozart has died. And a very wealthy man, very helpful man, very good man named Count Wallenstein, Wallenstein's the same dude, took together and put together a purse to get Beethoven to Vienna the second time. He said, you will inherit the spirit of Haydn, or the spirit of Mozart through Haydn. And he set him up with lessons with Joseph Haydn, who was probably the most famous composer in the German-speaking world at that time, which is the only thing that mattered to people from Germany and Austria. Yeah, I mean, Handel was dead from 1758, and Bach dead from 1750 and on. So it's interesting the time that we're telling about right now, because we heard the six great quartets from just at the end of the 18th century, about 1798 to about 1900. That's when Opus 18 comes. And then these fantastic quartets we heard last night, the Razumovsky quartets, Op.59 quartets. In between that, and then Beethoven nearly loses his hearing, nearly decides to take his own life, comes back from it, writes Eroica Symphony, and then he's working at right heat over the next 10, 12 years. Comes Fourth Symphony, Fifth Symphony, Sixth Symphony. You know, those two pieces were given a premiere on the same day. Can you imagine going to a concert, rock and roll concert, and here comes Beethoven, and he's got the Fifth Symphony and the Sixth Symphony and a whole bunch of new pieces too. I think the Fourth Piano Concerto came that night. Could be mixed up about that. No, five came a little later. I'm just trying to set up what it is that we're going to be hearing now tonight. The Razumovsky quartets are so great. If I say it's my favorite three in a row, boom. Each one of them is great, and they're quite long, but they're listable. You can get them the first time you hear them, kind of. And when you get to late quartets, it's going to take more involvement and more time maybe to get to the bit of them. And these two quartets we hear now at the beginning, they're the ones that get lost. They're not the Razumovsky, but they're not the late quartets either. So yeah, they're late quartets. Well, they are a few years later. I like the Harp Quartet very much. To me, it's sunny. Do you find that at all?
Absolutely, and maybe the main reason we should talk about it is the slide behind us. When Beethoven was working on the Harp Quartet, he was busy trying to get through this, and that's the invasion of Vienna by the French army. So the explosions of the cannons were actually quite deafening to him, and he still had a little bit of hearing. He wasn't stone deaf yet. So as you can see there, it was reported that he would tie pillows to his ears to protect himself, which really didn't help, as we know. But what was interesting is that he did have an out. And you might want to ask, why is it called the Harp Quartet? Well, it's called the Harp Quartet because in the first movement, there's pizzicato passages that the cello plays, and everybody said, hey, it's just like a harp. So Beethoven did have an out because he had three patrons who had a place like this. And they said, why don't you go and stay there and avoid Napoleon's army? For one thing, you can't get killed here, and it's only 18 kilometers from Vienna. So he was very happy here. And I think that's one of the reasons the opening of the harp is just so beautiful and so calm.
Do you know how long he stayed there? Because Beethoven moved a lot. Part of his neighbors wanted him to move a lot. He made so much racket. He wasn't the best downstairs or our upstairs neighbor. But during the time he was in Vienna, he got there in 1792, call it. And he died in 1827. So in that time, he had 60 residences, 60. Now, part of that, he moved out of Austria or out of Vienna every summer, so that's part of it. But he didn't come back to the same place. Restless guy.
So one could mistake this possibly for Haydn, except for the last note. He would never do that to you.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's the E-flat major, which is a homey key in a way. It's a key that people, both for men and women, usually find that you can sing a tune in E-flat major, just the way it lies out with human voice. And when Beethoven starts, he does start in E-flat major, but the last note of the first phrase is a D-flat, which doesn't belong. It's a flat seventh, and that's taken as... Ordinarily, when you start a piece, you want to go ahead, right? You start a piece might last 10, 15, 20 minutes, and you want to have a lot of forward motion. A D-flat, D, da, da, D. Could he play that opening again?
John, would you mind doing the same excerpt, please?
Listen to the first measure, and the last note we'll hear before the silence. There, that D-flat. That doesn't belong in D-flat major. If it were E-flat major, B, da. D is what he gives us here. But D, da, da, D, that'd be D natural if we were going to go ahead. But it's almost like he's automatically turning it back. He's trying to go toward a more peaceful, more quiet side. It's called the subdominant instead of the dominant. It's the one that goes far ahead.
You know, one of my teachers at Juilliard used to say that it's very sad that Beethoven's early period didn't last any longer because it was replaced by his middle period. But what's important is that it was replaced because Beethoven was looking for something completely different. And that heroic part that we heard in the Opus 59 last night are replaced with a serenity because he's kind of looking for something different in these quartets. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. We heard that in the Razumovskys brilliantly last night. Each one of those three quartets, completely different world the way he starts them. Now, Haydn and Mozart were both very original, but they wouldn't start three completely different ways. Well, G minor symphony, E flat major symphony, Jupiter symphony. I take it back. Mozart might have. There are three that come right at the end. But it's not the common thing. You find a word, you find a groove. Haydn was finding, he was comfortable. And whoever stuff, it was so beautiful and so effective. He didn't have to explain himself. People got it. Mozart didn't have to explain himself. Beethoven had a lot of explaining to do.
So staying with the first movement still, this is the comfortable allegro. So after the slow introduction, we have a comfortable allegro. Next one, please, John. So I think this is the kind of thing that Beethoven is basically saying, now I'm so comfortable that I'm not at war. I don't have to put pillows over my ears. And his favorite color, as we discovered, is yellow. He's a happy guy in a happy place. So he's giving you an allegro that is super happy. There is some more wild surprises. As we know, for Beethoven, there's always surprises. So in our next example, there are these crazy wild arpeggios with the cello trading with the second violin on pizzicato. Can you do that next passage, please?
Can I ask, you're a fiddle player. Is that terribly hard to play? It sounds really hard.
It sounds really hard, but I have to be honest, it's not that terrible. A lot of these late quartets, well, this is really middle period quartets, but a lot of the late quartets, they just don't lay well in the hand. This one lays great in the hand, but it's very impressive. So I think he's kind of basically saying to us, look, I'll give you a break here. You go impress your audience, and then these other places, which sound like nothing, you spend a lifetime trying to perfect, so this is not too bad. Now, let's look at the second movement. And in this second movement, the opening is an aria, like many second movements. But there's a very interesting marking that Beethoven gives, and it's mezzo voce. Now, in our business, we're very used to sotto voce. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if maybe you could explain, as a conductor and a composer.
Yeah, I told you most of the orchestras I played with, the guy said to mezzo voce, hey, boss, do you want it louder or softer? They didn't like that really. But in fact, between any kind of loud sound and a sound that, we usually write F, which means forte. That's loud. That's strong. It's actually what it means. Piano is softer. But between forte and piano are about 1 million little gradations, because it's not only the intensity, it's the sort of color and the attack, all of that sort of stuff, and your meaning. Just the way a great actor, without raising his voice very much, can enchant you with the way he can weave all of those colors together.
Absolutely. Let's listen to this example of the Amadeus Quartet mezzo voce. So it sounds to me like, even though it's up high, he never forces.
Yeah. I can't remember, Gary, is he write mezzo voce in all four parts or just in the lower instruments?
In all four parts,
Was it?
actually,
Yeah.
including the solo part. Yeah, I think the whole idea is we talked all week. We talked about the strings, and I'm sorry because I'm a violin nerd. I have to tell you something about strings. So much of this on the E string would have been at the edge of the fingerboard, meaning the fingerboard was much shorter than the instruments you'll see tonight, and anything to play mezzo voce when you have no support of the fingerboard is extremely difficult. And yet with the gut strings, it's much more possible than with the metal strings, which essentially we have to have support or we can't even play on it. Let's look at the third movement, which actually you'd think it'd be at least a scherzo, right? That was Beethoven's invention. After the minuet and trio, he said, sometimes I'm going to give you some scherzos. No. Here he says, play presto, even though it really is a scherzo. And what kind of rhythm is it? It's our Beethoven's fifth rhythm, but not in the tempo of Beethoven's fifth.
One of the things that's different between that and the Fifth Symphony, Fifth Symphony starts with a rest. It goes, bum, 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 bum. I mean, it's very fast, that's bum, 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 bum. But this doesn't have a rest, it just goes, bum, 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 bum. The first thing you hear is actually the beat.
Yeah, but it's also in the key of C minor. Right. So it's really interesting because if we want ta-ta-ta-dum, but this is twice as fast, da-ga-da-dum, da-ga-da-dum. Oh, yeah. And so it seems like it's almost Mendelssohnian in its fleetingness, but it's exactly the same rhythm and the same gesture. Now, the finale is a lilting E-flat major, and we talked about how E-flat major, at the time, you see in the slide, he was in a good place. He was getting paid, he was looking for a wife, he was looking, at 40, he's like, I've got to settle my life, I can't be yelling at servants all the time. So he's looking to write music that is beautiful and also very stable. So in this example, we'll hear the theme lilting in E-flat major with a sort of a rocking motion that is from ties. Next example, please. Yes, exactly. Comfortable, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now, the next variation is actually very interesting. It stars the second violin and the cello. And we talked in the last couple of days, the evolution of the cello really kind of started here because it used to be kind of a bass instrument where in the church, of course, you just accompany the bass line, maybe improvise. But here the cello starts and plays with the second violin as if they were starring instruments, which they are. And the first violin and the viola don't even play. They really have nothing to do. Let's hear that example.
Beautiful playing. Who's quartet playing?
Amadeus Quartet live performance. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
And did you tell me that they were doing that in the Musikverein?
Musikverein, exactly.
The great hall in Vienna.
Yeah.
I mean, that's absolutely beautiful playing. They're so elegant.
Yeah. Well, I always think about when we're little, right? They say, go practice your scales. This is why you practice your scales. Because when you get to the Musikverein, no time to get nervous about your scales. Yeah. Let's talk about the Serioso. This is actually, this is a good slide. This is the Black Forest, you guys, where Beethoven, when he was in Baden, he would take his walks, and apparently he liked certain trees, which inspired him. So here we are, the Serioso Quartet. Why is it called the Serioso? Oh, any ideas? No? Well, it's a very terse structure, but basically Beethoven said to the quartet that premiered it, they said, this is for connoisseurs. It is never to be heard in public. So, of course, it gets played all the time.
I think it's the shortest of all the quartets.
It is the shortest,
It's sort of most compact. In a funny kind of way, it's very modern. Is it kind of agitato about it?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted you to see the score is if you look at the very top, the very first couple of bars, and then the last stanza, all of the instruments are doing exactly the same rhythm. So it gives incredible orchestral power to it. Yeah, like this, the symphonies. Let's listen to that example, please. So you can see that this is very serious music. But as I mentioned before, he was actually in a very good place. He was in a very happy place. He was getting paid. He was looking to get married. You know, he was just basically saying, I need to settle my life. I think somewhere deep down inside he was saying that I got to stop with the reputation of yelling at everybody and storming out, and I'm going to do this thing. So the second part of this movement is incredible also because in rapid succession, you have all these ideas that Beethoven actually does not develop. And I can assure you it's not because he didn't have enough ideas to develop. I think he was very interested in changing the form of this quartet, where you wouldn't have 4 and 8 bar phrases, for example, where you would have the ability to show you something and then immediately show you something else, because some of it comes back in the recapitulation and some of it does not. The keys don't get prepared here, do they? He starts out, for example, in D flat major, and the next beat is an F major. So no preparation, not like he couldn't do it, but I think the whole idea was to reinvent the style of writing music, really, not just quartets. Yeah. Let's look at the beginning of the second movement here. The cello starts here, and I'd like you to listen to the 4th bar, no score. Specifically, I'll tell you about the ladies in a moment. But the reason that I want you to listen to the 4th bar is that he inserts a wrong note in order to confuse us what key is in. Let's listen to that.
I got a different opinion about that. It's a G sharp that you're talking about. So dim, dim, dum, 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 boom, boom. You know, it's like you're watching this old codger walking down the street. He takes a number of steps. He thinks, oh, I left something back at the house. He can either turn around on a dime or takes a step off to the side, because that's the easiest way not to fall over when you're turning around. I think that's what the G sharp is doing.
I'm sure you're right. I mean, I thought he thought it was in D major, but now he puts a G sharp in there, so it's A major.
But you know, D major, you give me a little break here. I'm going to fall down.
I do like it very much. This slide is very interesting because, as I mentioned before, Beethoven at this point has a salary, which was very unusual unless you were living, working for some king or a duke. And here he gets 4,000 florins, which is like enough to live on and not have to worry, but because there's no strings attached. So, of course, the first thing he does is he runs out and finds a 19-year-old, Teres Malfatti, who's a cousin of his doctor because he has major physical problems. And he proposes marriage to her. She turns him down. Then, apparently, went out, found 4 or 5 other people that he proposed to, and they all turned him down. Now, I'm sure you've seen the More Beloved, the film from the early 90s.
But, apparently, people talk about this much. He would play for them, and he was a brilliant performer, especially when we started improvising, and he's like improvising for you. He's playing this just for you, young lady. You think, wow. And then you get to know him, and he gets to be a little irascible. And so I'll come out and see you tomorrow night, and we can hear and then after a little while, the irascible takes over from the charm.
Absolutely. I have a feeling they loved listening to him, but I'm not sure they wanted to be with him every single day. So the Serioso, the end of this, I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to this, the dotted rhythm. We talked the other day about French Overture, and I wonder if because he actually writes Serioso over it, he wanted to make sure that nobody in the audience or in the quartet thought that this was a dance rhythm, because this is a very serious, deeply felt piece for him.
You guys all know what dots are? We're not talking polka dots. Okay. Say eighth note's got bum, 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 bum. Now, if I put a little dot on the first eighth note, I'll hold it longer, about half again of its length. And then to make the beats come out, I'll probably make the next note shorter. So that's a dotted eighth at a 16th. So instead of bum, bum, you get bum, da-dum, dum, da-dum, da-dum. That's a dotted rhythm. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. The Serioso part of this, I remember performing this actually in Israel, in the soldiers, this is now, of course, and they were saying, what is so much more Serioso about this quartet than any other? And I tried to explain to them that this is Beethoven's world that was very Serioso. Today, everything we play for you is Serioso. But in this case, it was just one of those things. Let's look at the fourth movement, the evolution of these two-note patterns. Very interesting. He takes a pattern from a higher note to a lower note, and then he flips it on its side so that the allegro part of it is actually a mirror image of that opener. Next example, please. That's actually the dotted rhythm we're talking about.
That one pregnant chord in the middle is soft music, and it's still soft, but there's something very agitated about it. That's another one of those diminished sevenths we were talking about last night. It's the music of the devil, said the medieval fathers. And Beethoven and Bernstein and all those other guys said, but I like the devil.
Those diminished chords are all full of thirds, aren't they? 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, yeah. All right, so the next example, we'll have those falling intervals. Let's hear that, please, John. Probably was a shock to the audience because, for one thing, most last movements, including many of Beethoven's quartets, are virtuoso pieces. Right. But this thing is in C minor. Right. And
that rhythm is interesting because it's essentially a waltz rhythm. It's much faster. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's a little faster than most. Dum, da, 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 dum. But here it gets Beethoven fifth kind of 3 notes to his 1. Ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum, ba da da da. Yeah, there's an agitated feeling to it that he was master of that, and he'd shake it up when it was getting like a little too calm.
Yeah, for sure. This gentleman right here is actually very important. He not only was the impetus for the Serioso Quartet, but also for many, many other works. Now, the nice thing about this is one of the few that Beethoven did write without a commission. And some historians believe that it is because Beethoven could not write it. So, he's very famous pretty much because he didn't have to pay for this quartet. Yeah, it's kind of nice to do that. If you go to your friend Beethoven and say, hey, would you write me a quartet? And he said, yes. And as opposed to, Lubkowitz says, here's 40 florins, I'll write you a quartet. Yeah, basically the idea was that's the end of the Serioso, where it's super dark, and then all of a sudden, Mendelssohn Scherzo. So no matter how deeply in serious it wasn't fully serious at the end, was it? So let's look at number 127. This is dedicated to Prince Golitsyn of Russia, who, if you remember Razumovsky from last night, we had an ambassador from Russia to Vienna, but Golitsyn was essentially just somebody who adored chamber music, and he, in a way, it would be fair to say that he was Beethoven's ambassador for Beethoven, not between two countries. For example, we'll talk later how Golitsyn arranged for Missa Solemnis to be premiered in St. Petersburg for the Tsars. And one of the reasons that this was important to Beethoven is because Beethoven had tried for a dozen years, if I'm not mistaken, to be hired by the Tsars, by Tsar Nicholas II, and the Tsar said no. Alexander I said no. So everybody said no to him, and he was like, can you help me out here? And he did. So Golitsyn commissioned the 3 quartets, of which the E-flat major, 127, is one. And it is a real masterpiece of construction, as well as melodies and accompaniment. Everything about it is unique.
I want to say that between the 2 quartets we were just talking about, the Harp Quartet and the Serioso, it's a gap of some years before he writes those late quartets. And stuff went up and down for him. He had trouble with, he always had a nephew he was trying to, having had no father figure, he was trying to take care of his nephew. And kid wasn't much help, it happens. But I mean, so that took him out of the composing business for a little while. Around the 17, 18, 20, he's got, by this time, 8, I think, or 7 at least, but 8 maybe of the 9 symphonies. And then there's a break there for a long time before he writes another. He stops writing piano sonatas. He doesn't write quartets for quite a while. And the piece we're going to hear now is on the other side of that when he's coming back. By this time, he's written, 9th Symphony, Missa Solemnis, the late piano sonatas, which are serene and celestial. So he's in another world by now.
Completely.
A different kind of, just from the opening call of this, there's just a calm to this, isn't it?
Exactly. We want to talk about the opening of it because he marks an Italian word called teneramente, as opposed to dolce. So let's listen to that and we'll talk about the difference.
remember, a young lady here had a score, I had to look it up. That first sound is so rich. That's because we're hearing 7 tones out of 4 players. 3 of them are playing double stops, the low E flat and B flat in the cello, same E flat and B flat an octave higher in the viola. Second violin has his only single note, G natural, and then the first one has G and A flat. So he's got so much jammed in this low register, which is not the loudest register by ordinarily.
It's actually one of the worst registers on the instrument.
Yeah. But he makes it like, so, wow, boom, 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 boom. And I love the way it listens to this off. It's magic, the way he makes those shifts. Beethoven, my great friend, composer, you know, Joan Tower?
Uh-huh.
She said, she loves Beethoven, but he drives her crazy because she can't do what he's trying to do, but she's still trying to learn from him. She's now 80 years old. She said, I love his gear shifts.
No automatic transmission. Teneramente. To me, teneramente is different from dolce, which means sweet, in that there's an innocence to it. And in this music, I think you hear a purity, which of course you can have in dolce as well. But dolce inherently is sweet, and this is innocent. What do you think?
What do you say?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's just one man's opinion.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because after this intensity, he melts into the teneramente, and it couldn't be anything else.
Yeah, we were talking about, I don't know exactly what teneramente means. And I said, when I would see it in an orchestra score, I realized I could make a pun of it. I would think it sounded like tender, like the English word tender to me. And it usually seemed like somebody's went to hold the notes and embrace the notes. So I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what I would try to get orchestras to do, tender.
Absolutely. Let's take a little moment just to talk about Golitsyn because he was an important figure. Interestingly enough, like many of the Russian army people, he was a passionate musician. In fact, I have to tell you that I saw a Strad with a hole in it from one of Napoleon's generals because apparently he took his Strad on the battlefield and it got a round in it. Fortunately, it's repaired. Sounds great, not to worry. But these guys really were passionate about going to war with their instruments. He also loved Beethoven, like Lobkowitz. And as I said, he was kind of an ambassador with the Tsar for Beethoven. He was a personal agent, essentially. You know, and I don't know whether he charged for that, but I do say that he had more influence with the Tsar and with the Russian court than Beethoven had with his other agents. So Golitsyn was a very interesting and important person. Second movement of this has a lilt, and it's in 12/8. Maybe we can talk about what is 12/8 and what is a common beat in 12/8.
Okay. You know what? Two hearts beating 3/4 time. We all know what that is. Like 3 beats in the measure, 2, 3. Okay. March got 2 beats in the measure. The Barker roll generally is in 6/8. It goes dee da 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 dee dee do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 6. 12/8 is a double Barker roll. It's like 2 measures squeaked together. And it tends to get a kind of music, if Handel uses it, it's a pastoral scene. Beethoven uses it in a pastoral symphony. You slow the tempo down. It's like we're now in a room where we don't have to hurry anymore. That's what 12/8 can do.
Wow, excellent, yeah. This is a slide of the Opus 127 performance. Apparently, the Chupanzich Quartet, Ignaz was a very fine violinist, but they could not figure this piece out, and neither could the audience. Apparently, it was a mess. All Beethoven heard was, it was a terrible performance, and everybody loves his music. So he was not happy, and he was not at this performance. Fortunately, I have an example of an outstanding performance. Let's hear the next example, please. could see, though, why they would be confused. So the common beat is the eighth note triplet in 12/8, and it's always off by one note with that tie, da, ba, ba, da, dum, da, da. And it's also slow. So unless you know the score very, very well, I can see that probably we're trying to find each other rather than make music, which is exactly the wrong thing to do when you're trying to premiere a piece of music. You're trying to sell it to the audience. So fortunately, as I said, we have a great performance of it, and we'll definitely have an incredible performance of it live in a few minutes.
And you just whispered the word Mahler to me in the middle of that.
Yeah, well,
Because we've only talked so far about Beethoven in this now 1820s period. His influence behind that was phenomenal. Greater, I think, than anyone. Greater than Monteverdi in the 17th century. Greater than Bach, because Bach was more or less a local cat. If you weren't in Leipzig, you didn't get to hear that much of his music. But with Beethoven, it's all over the world. And we get composers down to the 20th century, people like Mahler doting on Beethoven adagios, and then go beyond that to Shostakovich or Benjamin Britten, and beyond George Rochberg.
Yeah, it's just an incredible opening of that cello solo where literally for about 12, 15 seconds, nobody knows what the key is. And then all of a sudden, the sky's open and it's sunshine. Yeah, quite amazing. But I will have to say that Beethoven, he couldn't help himself. He was the master of architecture. So our next example is actually a super charming dance where nobody can make a mistake of what's going on. Let's hear that, please. Couldn't be more intimate, and everybody knows exactly when to play, and the ties are exactly in the same place. But because he moves the tempo a little bit, it's easier to follow. Incredible writing. Third movement, should we talk about it? He marks it scherzando, and we're all used to scherzo. What does that mean, scherzando?
I don't know the difference between a scherzo and a scherzando. It's a different verb form. I think it might be. Now you're really winding a scherzo up.
Maybe it's a diminutive scherzo. Maybe it's not such a serious scherzo, but scherzo means joke. So maybe it's not so funny. What do you think?
You think that's not funny?
Getting very much into the weeds. Okay. Yeah, look at the Beethoven Museum while we're thinking about it. But the scherzando is very interesting because it's, when we talked the other day about the obsession with Italian opera by the Austrians, and this music is so Rossini. It has such an incredible sense of humor that you kind of cannot believe what just happened in the beginning of that movement. Let's hear that example, please. So it's just cute, right? And still, he makes the first violinist play way up high, where there's no fingerboard to support it. But it's not about that. It's about just having fun with this scherzo. And I guess it's just a shorter version of a scherzo you would have had maybe in the earlier quartets, something like that. Now, the finale is actually very interesting because it's a hymn. And this slide is pretty much there. Why did he depart from the heroic Beethoven to be replaced by the mystical Beethoven? Probably because he's looking at his life, and he had overcome a lot, including now being stone deaf and writing this glorious music, and the premiere of the choral symphony, which he didn't hear a single note. So he's kind of looking at this as maybe his thanks to God or something like that. But certainly this is not a virtuoso last movement, nor is it anything other than the spirit of Beethoven communicating with us on a very personal level. And interesting that it could almost be Mendelssohn, I would say. Yeah.
And I can hear what Brahms learned from that,
Yeah,
too.
for sure.
It's a kind of calm way that Brahms writes, like second or last movement of the D major symphony of Brahms. It's like, it's very fast, but it's just gentle.
Yeah, and it gets you to a very different place. It's neither virtuosity or melody accompanied somewhere where you don't need to think about it as much as just take it all in. That's kind of the beginning and the end of our show. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
And you get the Heroes Award for being able to talk. We're going to send him home with elderberry. You know what? Black elderberry kept Mozart alive for a long time. I know he died at age 35, but without black elderberry, he'd been dead by 12. It's a really good thing when you get a cold coming on. There's a fancy word, sambucol or something like that. You get it in a health food store. But black elderberry is one of the best immune things. You got to get your full black elderberry.
By tomorrow.
I think maybe a little Scotch whiskey would help.
Absolutely. Enjoy tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.